A badge and a burden. The Louisiana morning was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and made everything feel heavier than it should. Detective Greg Mathers stepped out of his squad car, the slam of the door echoing across the nearly empty parking lot of the Baton Rouge courthouse. He was already in a foul mood. Court appearances were the worst part of the job, pointless formalities that forced him to sit in a stiff wooden chair and listen to lawyers twist the truth in ways that made his blood boil. Today's case wasn't even important, just another defense attorney trying to push back against charges that should have been open and shut. But the district attorney insisted Mathers be present, and when the DA gave an order, he followed it. He adjusted the belt around his waist, feeling the familiar weight of his holster, his badge, and the years of authority that came with them. He had been on the force for over a decade, and in that time, he had learned two things. The law was flexible, and respect was not given. It was taken. Inside, the courthouse bustled with the usual morning energy. Lawyers in pressed suits shuffled between rooms, clerks carried stacks of paperwork, and bailiffs kept a watchful eye on the flow of people coming and going. Mathers barely glanced at them. He had other things on his mind, like getting through this testimony as quickly as possible so he could get back to real work. And then he saw her. A woman stood near the corridor leading to the judge's chambers, speaking to a group of attorneys. Black, confident, and dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, she had an air of authority that didn't sit right with him. Something about the way she held herself, the way the lawyers around her seemed to actually listen when she spoke, it rubbed him the wrong way. People like her were usually in one of two categories in a place like this. Either they were here to argue a case, or they were here to be processed. And since he hadn't seen her around before, she was obviously here for the latter. He adjusted his stance, straightened his posture, and walked toward her. No badge, no ID, just another loud voice in a place where she didn't belong, he thought. "Ma'am," he said, letting his voice carry the weight of his authority. "You can't be here. This is a restricted area." She turned slowly, her gaze locking onto his with an expression so calm it made his insides burn. No fear, no hesitation, just quiet, patient annoyance. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice smooth and measured. Mathers narrowed his eyes. He hated when people played dumb. "I said," he repeated, stepping closer, "this area is for court officials and law enforcement only. If you don't have business here, you need to move along." The lawyers around her shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged looks, but none of them spoke up. "I have business here," the woman said, crossing her arms, "and I don't think I need your permission to stand where I'm standing." His jaw clenched. "Here we go. I don't have time for this," he muttered. His patience was razor thin, and this woman's attitude wasn't helping. He squared his shoulders, planting his feet firmly on the polished courthouse floor. "Look," he said, voice dropping lower, "I'm not going to ask again. You need to. I don't need to do anything." She cut in smoothly. The way she said it, so controlled, so unbothered, made something deep in his chest tighten. Who the hell did she think she was? His hand hovered near his belt, not on his weapon, but close enough to remind her that he wasn't just some security guard. "You got ID on you?" he asked, his tone sharp. A smirk flickered across her face. Not nervous, not intimidated, just amused. "Do you?" she shot back. That did it. A flicker of something hot and angry burned through him. He had seen this kind of defiance before, the kind that came from people who thought they were above the law, who thought they could talk their way out of trouble. It never lasted long. "I'm done talking," he said, stepping forward. And then he grabbed her arm. The second his hand made contact, the reaction was immediate. Sharp gasps, a sudden movement from the side. And then, "Detective Mathers, stand down." The voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. Mathers barely had time to register what was happening before a strong hand gripped his wrist, pulling him away. Sergeant Henry Adams stood there, his face a mix of panic and disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Adams hissed under his breath. Mathers scowled, handling a situation. Adams' eyes widened, then darted toward the woman, the one Mathers had just grabbed. She adjusted her sleeve, calmly brushing off the moment like it was nothing. But the energy in the room had completely changed. Adams looked like he wanted to slap him. "Do you even know who you're talking to?" he whispered harshly. Mathers stared, frustration boiling over. "She's trespassing," he snapped. "If she has a problem with that, she can." "That's Chief Morgan," Adams said. Silence. The words didn't fit. They didn't make sense. Chief who? And then, like a slow-moving wreck, it hit him. A name he had barely paid attention to. A name that had come up in hushed conversations at the precinct. A name he had ignored because he figured she wouldn't last long anyway. Chief Alexis Morgan, the new chief of police, his boss. The attorneys around them were dead silent. Some looked like they wanted to disappear. Others looked like they were trying not to enjoy this too much. And Chief Morgan. She just stood there, watching him. Her face was unreadable. Then, after what felt like a year, she finally spoke. Her voice was even, measured, deadly calm. "Detective Mathers," she said, "let's talk about this in my office." Mathers felt his stomach drop. But this was only the beginning. The weight of a name. The silence in the chief's office was heavier than the thick Louisiana air outside. Detective Greg Mathers sat stiffly in one of the two wooden chairs in front of the large mahogany desk. Across from him, Chief Alexis Morgan stood near the window, arms crossed over her chest, the city skyline stretching behind her like an audience waiting for a verdict. The air conditioning hummed softly, the only sound in the room besides the faint rustling of papers on her desk. She hadn't spoken since they entered. She hadn't sat down either. She just stood there, studying him, dissecting him. Mathers swallowed hard. He had been in situations like this before. Tense conversations with superiors, a slap on the wrist, a warning. But this felt different. It wasn't the first time he had stepped over the line. It wasn't even the first time someone had called him out for it. But it was the first time he had been pulled into a private office by someone who outranked him and didn't look at him like he was salvageable. Chief Morgan finally turned away from the window. She walked to her desk, leaned against it, and met his gaze head-on. "Detective," she said, her voice calm, "explain to me what happened out there." Mathers took a breath, choosing his words carefully. "I didn't recognize you, Chief." Morgan tilted her head slightly, and that justified grabbing my arm. His jaw clenched. He was already losing control of the conversation. "With all due respect," he said, keeping his tone even, "I thought you were somewhere you weren't supposed to be." Chief Morgan let the words hang between them, as if she were waiting for him to hear them the way she had. "So let's get this straight," she said, tapping a finger on the desk. "You saw a black woman standing in a courthouse and assumed she wasn't supposed to be there." Mathers flinched at the way she said it. "I assumed you were a civilian in a restricted area," he corrected, grasping at anything that could justify his actions. Morgan gave a small, humorless chuckle. "Right, and if I had been a civilian, you think what you did was appropriate?" Mathers pressed his lips together. This wasn't a conversation. It was an interrogation. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one asking the questions. Morgan stepped forward, placing her hands flat on the desk. "Tell me, Detective, do you know how many complaints you have on file?" Mathers knew. He always knew. But he shook his head anyway. Morgan's lips pressed into a tight line. 17. He stared at her. "That's not counting the ones that got lost in paperwork," she added, her tone sharp as a blade. Mathers kept his expression blank, but something hot coiled in his gut. She knew. Not just about today. Not just about the woman he had grabbed. She knew about all of it. The excessive force allegations, the people who had filed complaints and never heard back, the ones who had heard back but were told their cases weren't strong enough to warrant further investigation. She wasn't just here to discipline him. She was here to dismantle everything that had protected him for years. "Chief, She raised a hand, cutting him off. "I don't need your excuses, Mathers. I need you to understand something." She straightened, fixing him with a look so sharp it could cut steel. "This department has protected officers like you for too long. That ends now." The words hit him harder than a fist. She wasn't giving him a warning. She was issuing a death sentence to his career. A bead of sweat trickled down the back of his neck. "This city isn't kind to weakness," he said, his voice low. "We're not out there writing parking tickets, Chief. We deal with real criminals. People who don't respect the law. People like me." She asked, her voice dangerously calm. Mathers froze. He hadn't said it outright, but she had heard it anyway. Morgan let the silence stretch just long enough for it to sink in. Then she exhaled slowly, as if she were debating whether or not he was even worth her time. "That's the problem with officers like you," she said. "You think you're maintaining order. You think you're the last line of defense between good people and bad people." She shook her head, a look of tired disappointment crossing her face. "But what you really are," she said, "is predictable." The words were a slap to the face. He had spent years perfecting his reputation. He was respected. He was feared. But she wasn't impressed. And that was more infuriating than anything. Morgan turned and walked toward the filing cabinet in the corner. She pulled open a drawer, retrieved a single thin folder, and set it on the desk in front of him. It had his name on it. "You've been given more second chances than you deserve," she said. "This time, there won't be another one." Mathers felt his pulse hammer in his ears. This was real. This wasn't something he could talk his way out of. This wasn't something he could push under the rug with the right connections. Morgan sat down in her chair, folding her hands in front of her. "There's going to be an investigation," she said. "And I suggest you start thinking about what you'll say when Internal Affairs calls you in." Mathers met her gaze, his mind racing. He could fight this. He had to fight this. He wasn't the first officer to get called into an IA investigation. If he played his cards right, he could survive this. He just needed to be careful. "How long do I have?" he asked, keeping his voice as neutral as possible. Morgan tilted her head slightly, as if she were amused by the question. "That depends," she said. "How long does it take for a man to realize he's out of options?" Mathers clenched his jaw. That was it. That was the game she was playing. She wanted him to feel powerless. She wanted him to understand that for the first time in his career, there was no back door, no loophole, no easy way out. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted him to wonder if this was what it felt like for the people he had spent years pushing around. Morgan stood, signaling the conversation was over. "You're dismissed, Detective," she said. Mathers hesitated for only a second before standing. He turned toward the door, his heart pounding, his mind racing. Everything was different now. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure where he stood. As he stepped out of the office and into the hallway, he realized something. She hadn't raised her voice once. She hadn't threatened him. She hadn't needed to. Because real power wasn't about force. Real power was about control. And Morgan had all of it. The fall of the untouchable. The sun was already high in the sky when Detective Greg Mathers stepped out of the chief's office, but he felt cold. The door clicked shut behind him with a quiet finality, and for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he'd ever walk through that door again as a cop. His boots echoed against the polished courthouse floors as he moved, his body going through the motions, but his mind was spinning. 17 complaints, 5 excessive force allegations, an internal affairs investigation, and a boss who wasn't playing by the same rules he had relied on for years. The precinct had always been his fortress, a place where officers like him, ones who knew how to get things done, were protected, insulated from the consequences that would have ruined lesser men. He had built a reputation on being tough, no nonsense, and willing to do what needed to be done to keep law and order. But today, for the first time, he felt like a man standing on quicksand. Eyes followed him as he made his way through the courthouse lobby. Some people looked away quickly, pretending not to have noticed him. Others whispered to each other, their gazes lingering just a little too long. News traveled fast. By the time he reached his car, his stomach was churning with something he refused to name: fear. Mathers pulled open the driver's side door, slid into the seat, and gripped the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. For years, he had been the one in control. Now, for the first time, he wasn't sure where he stood. The precinct is no longer home. When he pulled into the station's lot, he hesitated for just a moment before stepping out. As soon as he entered the building, the shift in the atmosphere hit him like a freight train. Conversations that had been lively a moment ago died down. Officers turned their heads slightly, their eyes flickering toward him before quickly looking away. They knew. Sergeant Henry Adams barely glanced at him as he passed by. A few rookies whispered behind their hands, avoiding his gaze when he turned toward them. And then there were the veterans, the ones who had always treated him like one of their own. They didn't nod in greeting. They didn't say his name. They just pretended he wasn't there. A slow burn started in his chest. What was this? He had been here for over a decade, had put in more time than half these guys combined. He had mentored some of them, stood by their sides in the field, covered for them when things got messy. And now, they were all acting like he was a ghost. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to keep walking. The captain's office was just ahead. A career in the balance. Captain Neil Porter was a no-nonsense man with graying hair and a permanent scowl. Mathers had known him for years. They weren't exactly friends, but they understood each other. Porter wasn't the kind of leader who got involved unless he had to. He let his officers handle things, and as long as the numbers looked good, he didn't ask too many questions. But today, when Mathers stepped into his office, Porter's expression was unreadable. "Close the door," the captain said, his voice flat. Mathers obeyed, standing stiffly in front of the desk. Porter exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw before leaning back in his chair. "You really screwed up this time, Greg." Mathers kept his face neutral. "It was a misunderstanding." Porter scoffed. 17 complaints say otherwise." Mathers gritted his teeth. "Those were exaggerated. You know how people are. They don't like it when a cop does his job. They file complaints because they don't get their way." Porter studied him for a long moment. "You really believe that?" Mathers didn't blink. "I know it." The captain sighed, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "This time is different." Mathers crossed his arms. "Because she's the chief." Porter nodded. "Exactly." He let the silence stretch between them, letting the weight of that truth sink in. "She's not like the others," Porter said finally. "She's not going to let this slide." Mathers felt his pulse hammer in his ears. Porter sighed. "Look, you've had a lot of people looking out for you over the years. You know that. But Morgan, she's looking to clean house. And you just put a target on your back." Mathers clenched his jaw. "So what? You're just going to let her hang me out to dry?" Porter's eyes darkened. "I covered for you before, Greg. More times than I should have. I looked the other way because I believed you were a good cop. But now I don't know what I believe." Something cold settled in Mathers' stomach. "You're on administrative leave," Porter continued, his voice final. "Effective immediately. Internal Affairs will contact you for an official interview." Mathers took a step forward, his voice sharp. "You're suspending me. Pending investigation." "This is bull." Porter stood up so fast his chair scraped against the floor. "This is reality, detective," he snapped. "And if you don't like it, that's your problem." Mathers gritted his teeth, his fists curling at his sides. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Porter should have had his back. The precinct was supposed to protect its own. Instead, He was being thrown to the wolves. "I suggest you start thinking about your next move," Porter said. Mathers stared at him for a long moment before turning on his heel and walking out. The entire station felt different as he stepped through the halls. It wasn't his home anymore. And for the first time in his life, he realized something terrifying. He had spent years playing the game. But now, the rules had changed, and he had no idea how to win. The sinking ship. Back in his car, Mathers sat in silence. His badge sat heavy on his chest. His gun, strapped to his hip, felt like dead weight. Everything he had built, everything he had relied on, was slipping through his fingers. His reputation was cracked. His position was no longer bulletproof. For years, he had believed in power. The kind of power that came from authority, from fear, from knowing that no matter what happened, the system would back him up. But now, the system wasn't on his side anymore. And Chief Morgan, she wasn't just another politician in a uniform. She was a force of nature. And she was coming for him. Mathers exhaled sharply, his grip tightening on the wheel. No, he wasn't going down without a fight. If they thought he was just going to roll over and accept this, they had another thing coming. He still had options. He still had allies. And he wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The wolves at the door. Detective Greg Mathers had spent over a decade walking into the precinct with his head high, his stride confident, his authority unquestioned. He had built his career on a foundation of fear and control, knowing that the system would always bend in his favor. But today, as he sat in his car outside the station, staring at the front doors, that confidence was gone. The system wasn't bending anymore. And for the first time, the walls were closing in. The enemy within. Inside the precinct, the tension was suffocating. Conversations died when Mathers entered the room, replaced by hushed whispers. Officers he had once worked alongside barely met his gaze. The air was thick with something unspoken. Fear. No. Something worse. Anticipation. Like they were waiting for the moment he fell. At his desk, a few papers sat stacked neatly, but he knew better than to think everything was normal. This wasn't his space anymore. It hadn't been since the moment Chief Morgan had pulled him into that office and cracked the illusion of his invincibility. Then, as if the universe was determined to remind him just how deep he was sinking, a voice cut through the silence. "Detective Mathers," a woman's voice called. He turned, and there she was. Officer Janice Herrera. Young, ambitious, and worst of all, sharp. The kind of cop who actually believed in justice rather than just enforcing order. And the kind of cop who had never liked him. Mathers forced his expression into something neutral. "What do you need, officer?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Internal Affairs is here. They're ready for you." A cold chill ran down his spine. So soon. They weren't wasting any time. "Fine," he said, standing slowly. He wasn't about to let them see him hesitate. "Let's get this over with." Herrera didn't move at first. She just watched him, as if waiting to see if he would crack. Then she turned and led the way. Mathers followed, feeling every set of eyes on him as he walked past the desks and down the hall toward the Aya conference room. The wolves were at the door, and he was about to walk straight into their den. The investigation begins. Inside the conference room, the air was heavy with unspoken tension. 3 people sat across from him at the long, sterile table. 2 IA investigators, 1 man, 1 woman, both with the same unreadable expressions. And at the center of it all, sitting with her hands folded neatly on the table, was Chief Alexis Morgan. Mathers felt his jaw tighten. Of course she was here. She wanted to watch him squirm. The lead investigator, a wiry man with graying hair, adjusted his glasses and opened a file. "Detective Mathers," he began, his voice even. "You're here today regarding multiple complaints filed against you over the course of your career. Specifically, we'll be discussing the most recent incident at the courthouse." Mathers nodded. Understood. The woman to the investigator's left, a sharp-eyed officer named Lisa Cho, spoke next. "Do you deny that you physically grabbed Chief Morgan during that encounter?" Mathers forced himself to keep his posture relaxed. "No, I don't deny it." Cho nodded. "And do you believe your actions were justified?" He exhaled slowly. "I thought she was a civilian in a restricted area. I was doing my job." Morgan didn't react. She didn't so much as blink. Cho exchanged a glance with the lead investigator before flipping to another page in the file. "Detective Mathers," she continued, "you have 17 complaints on record, including 5 for excessive force. Would you like to explain why that is?" Mathers didn't flinch. "I work in high-risk situations. I deal with dangerous individuals. Sometimes force is necessary." Cho's lips pressed into a thin line. 17 times. Mathers met her gaze evenly. "Sometimes the people we deal with don't respect authority." At that, Morgan finally spoke. "And you think respect is earned through force?" she asked, her voice calm but razor-sharp. Mathers clenched his jaw. "I think it's earned through control," he corrected. Morgan tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. Then she leaned forward, her dark eyes boring into his. "You're right," she said. "Control is important." She tapped the file in front of her. "And right now, you're losing yours." A slow, twisting sensation curled in Mather's stomach. She wasn't talking about just this investigation. She was talking about everything. His career, his reputation, his power. And she was right. He could feel it slipping. A system that no longer bends. The questioning went on for nearly an hour, each question pressing deeper, pulling apart his defenses piece by piece. By the time it was over, Mathers felt like a man who had barely survived an ambush. Morgan stood as the IA officers closed their files. "There will be a full review of your record," she said. "Until then, you're suspended pending the outcome of this investigation." Mathers' breath caught in his throat. Suspended. Not just administrative leave. Not just a slap on the wrist. A full-blown suspension. And if IA found enough, that could mean termination. He stood slowly, forcing himself to keep his expression blank. Morgan stepped toward him, lowering her voice so that only he could hear. "I told you," she said, "this department isn't a place for men who can't control themselves." Mathers swallowed hard. "I'll be watching," she added. Then she turned and walked away. The room felt colder as the door clicked shut behind her. Nowhere to run. By the time Mathers left the precinct that evening, everything felt different. His badge, the thing that had once felt like a shield, was now just a weight on his chest. The people he had worked alongside for years weren't allies anymore. And the city, the one he had thought he controlled, was no longer his to rule. For the first time, Greg Mathers realized something terrifying. He had spent years bending the system to his will. But now, the system was bending back, and it was about to break him. The walls closing in. Detective Greg Mathers walked out of the precinct with a storm brewing in his chest. He had barely crossed the threshold before he heard the whispers. Cops who used to nod at him, used to back him up without question, now muttered behind his back. A few of them exchanged knowing looks as he passed. It wasn't just the IA investigation. It was the fact that he had lost control. He clenched his fists. Morgan had done this. She had turned the system against him. She had walked in like she owned the place, stripped away the protections he had relied on for years, and dared to make an example out of him. And worst of all, she was winning. The last friend standing. The second Mathers got into his car, he reached for his phone. There were only a handful of numbers he trusted, and even fewer people who would still pick up his call. He scrolled past contacts who would no longer risk their careers to back him. Officers who once called him brother, but were now avoiding him like a sinking ship. Then he landed on the one name that mattered. Sage, Frank Delaney. Delaney had been on the force longer than Mathers had. He was old school, the kind of cop who didn't just play the game. He wrote the damn rules. If anyone could help him navigate this, it was him. He hit the call button. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." "It's me," Mathers said, his tone clipped. "We need to talk." A pause. Then, "Where?" "I'll come to you." Delaney hesitated. "Not at my place." Mathers frowned. Delaney was cautious, but this was unusual. "Fine," Mathers said. "Benny's. 1 hour. Make it quick." The line went dead. Mathers exhaled sharply, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. Even Delaney was being careful. That wasn't a good sign. A meeting in the shadows. Benny's diner was a cop hangout. It had been for years. The food was greasy, the coffee was burnt, and the owner didn't ask questions. Mathers arrived early, picking a booth near the back where the lights were dim, and the conversation from the other tables blended into meaningless background noise. Delaney walked in 10 minutes later, dressed in plain clothes, but still carrying himself like a man who had seen too much and survived anyway. He slid into the booth across from Mathers and wasted no time. "You're in deep," Delaney said, his voice low. Mathers scoffed. "No shit." Delaney leaned back, crossing his arms. "How bad is it?" Mathers exhaled through his nose. "I is digging through my record. Morgan's making sure I don't get out of this clean." Delaney tapped his fingers on the table. "She's got the DA on her side. Word is, they're tired of dealing with bad cases because of questionable policing." Mathers bristled. "I did my job." Delaney gave him a pointed look. "And now they're saying you did it too well." Mathers clenched his jaw. "What are you hearing?" Delaney lowered his voice. "Morgan's not just looking at your complaints. She's looking at everything. Your cases, your arrests, your reports. She's talking to people. People who wouldn't have spoken up before." A slow, sinking feeling settled in Mathers' gut. Morgan wasn't just trying to suspend him. She was building a case. Something she could use to make sure he never put on a badge again. "You still got people inside?" Mathers asked. Delaney hesitated, and that told Mathers everything he needed to know. "I can't pull the same strings I used to," Delaney admitted. "Not with Morgan watching everything. She's got Aya crawling all over the place. If I try to intervene, it puts a target on me." Mathers' jaw tightened. "So you're telling me I'm on my own?" Delaney didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I'm telling you to be smart." Mathers leaned forward. "I don't need advice, Frank. I need options." Delaney studied him for a long moment. Then he sighed. "There's one play left," he said. Mathers narrowed his eyes. "I'm listening." Delaney lowered his voice even further. "You know that lawyer, Randall Pierce?" Mathers scowled. "The civil rights guy?" "Yeah," Delaney nodded. "Morgan's been meeting with him." Mathers stiffened. "Why?" Delaney's gaze was sharp. "Because she's digging. And if she finds something that sticks, she's not just gonna fire you. She's gonna make sure you go down." Mathers' stomach twisted. Morgan wasn't just looking to get him out of the department. She was setting him up for something worse. "You need to get ahead of this," Delaney warned. "Find out what she knows. And if there's anything they can't prove, make sure it stays that way." Mathers ran a hand over his face. This was worse than he thought. Much worse. The desperation play. By the time Mathers left the diner, his mind was racing. Morgan was playing a different game. One that didn't rely on unwritten rules or quiet favors. She was going for the kill. And if he didn't move fast, she was going to bury him. There was only one thing left to do. He had to take control of the situation before it was too late. Before Morgan closed the trap completely. Mathers pulled out his phone and scrolled to a name he hadn't called in a long time. It was time to call in a favor. Not from a cop. Not from the department. But from someone who knew how to make problems disappear. He pressed the call button. It rang once. Twice. Then a deep voice answered. "This better be important." Mathers exhaled sharply. "It is," he said. "I need a cleanup job." A pause. Then, how messy. Mathers glanced in his rearview mirror, his reflection staring back at him. "If I don't handle this now," he said, voice low, "it's gonna get a lot messier." The breaking point. As he ended the call, Mathers knew one thing for certain. Chief Morgan had underestimated him. She thought she could just push him out. She thought he would roll over and accept his fate. But she was wrong. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And if she wanted a fight, she was about to get one. A dangerous game. Greg Mathers had always believed in power, the kind that came with a badge, a gun, and a reputation that made people step aside when he walked into a room. For years, he had used that power to his advantage, bending the system in his favor, keeping himself above the rules that applied to everyone else. But now, as he sat in his car under the dim glow of a streetlight, his world was unraveling. Chief Alexis Morgan was coming for him. Internal affairs was breathing down his neck. And for the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted. The last resort. The voice on the other end of the line was low and measured. "You need a cleanup job." Mathers exhaled slowly. "I need information." A chuckle. "That's not what you said a minute ago." Mathers' grip tightened on the steering wheel. "I don't need a body buried. I need to know what Morgan has on me." The man on the other end of the call was Vincent Cade, an ex-cop who had been forced out of the department years ago under a cloud of suspicion. Officially, Cade had retired early. Unofficially, he had built a new career doing the kind of work that never made it onto paper. Surveillance, blackmail, disappearing inconvenient evidence. If there was dirt to be found, Cade would find it. Mathers had never needed his services before. He had always been the one in control. But now he was out of options. Cade took his time responding. "Morgan's smart," he finally said. "She wouldn't make a move unless she already had something solid." "That's what I need to know," Mathers said. "What does she have? Who's talking to her? And how do I make this go away?" A pause. Then, "It's gonna cost you." Mathers expected that. "How much?" "Depends on what I find." Mathers clenched his jaw. He wasn't in a position to negotiate. "Fine." Cade chuckled. "You really pissed off the wrong person this time, huh?" Mathers didn't answer. "Give me a day," Cade said. "I'll be in touch." The line went dead. Mathers tossed his phone onto the passenger seat and exhaled through gritted teeth. Everything was riding on this. If Cade couldn't find something Morgan didn't want getting out, something Mathers could use as leverage, then this was over. He wasn't just fighting for his career anymore. He was fighting to keep himself from becoming another fallen cop, one of the names that got plastered on the news as an example of justice being served. And he wasn't about to let that happen. The past comes knocking. By the time Mathers pulled into his driveway, the sky was dark, and his house was shrouded in silence. He barely had time to step inside before a knock sounded at the door. His pulse jumped. No one came to his house unannounced. His hand instinctively hovered near his waistband as he walked to the door, but he didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. When he pulled it open, he found himself face to face with Randall Pierce, the civil rights lawyer, the same man Delaney had warned him about. Mathers' stomach turned. Pierce was tall and lean, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture relaxed, but there was something behind his gaze, something that said he wasn't here for small talk. "How the hell did you get my address?" Mathers demanded. Pierce gave a small smile. "I have my ways." Mathers didn't move. "What do you want?" Pierce's smile faded. "A conversation." Mathers let out a harsh laugh. "I don't have anything to say to you." Pierce nodded. "That's fine. You don't have to say anything. Just listen." Mathers exhaled sharply. Everything in him told him to slam the door in this man's face, but something stopped him. Curiosity, or maybe desperation. After a long pause, he stepped aside. "Make it quick." Pierce walked in, taking a slow glance around the house before turning to face him. "You've got a problem, detective," he said. Mathers scoffed. "Yeah, no kidding." Pierce ignored the sarcasm. "I know about the IA investigation, and I know Chief Morgan isn't the only one looking into you." Mathers' jaw tightened. "What's that supposed to mean?" Pierce tilted his head slightly. "It means you're not just dealing with internal affairs. You've got federal eyes on you now." Mathers felt his stomach drop. "What?" Pierce sighed. "You've made a lot of enemies over the years, detective. And some of them have been waiting for the right moment to take you down. Morgan might be leading the charge, but she's not the only one playing the game." Mathers forced his expression to remain neutral. "What do you know?" Pierce studied him for a moment. "I know that a few of your past cases are being re-examined. That means new witnesses, new statements. People who were too scared to speak up before are talking now." Mathers' fingers twitched at his side. He had always known this day might come, but he hadn't expected it to happen this fast. Pierce stepped closer. "This is your last chance to get ahead of this," he said. "If you cooperate." Mathers laughed. A short, bitter sound. "You think I'm going to roll over?" he said. "Just hand myself over." Pierce's expression didn't change. "I think your choices are running out." Mathers took a step forward, his voice dropping to something sharp and dangerous. "You don't know me," he said, "and you sure as hell don't know what I'm capable of." Pierce held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded, as if he had just come to a decision. "That's what I was afraid of," he said. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. But before he left, he glanced over his shoulder one last time. "You might want to ask yourself something, detective," he said. "How many people are willing to go down with you?" Then he was gone, and Mathers was left standing in the silence of his own house, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: doubt. The clock is ticking. Mathers barely slept that night. By the time the sun rose, his mind was still spinning. Morgan was after him. Aya was after him. And now, if Pierce was telling the truth, the feds were watching too. That meant he had a new problem. Someone inside the department was feeding information to the outside. Someone was talking. Mathers grabbed his phone and dialed Cade's number. It rang twice before the ex-cop answered. "Tell me you found something," Mathers said, skipping any pleasantries. Cade's voice was calm. "I did." Mathers sat up. "And?" There was a short pause. Then Cade said something that made Mathers' blood run cold. "You've got a rat." Mathers' grip tightened on the phone. "Who?" Another pause. Then, "Sergeant Henry Adams." Mathers' breath hitched. Adams, one of his own. One of the guys who had always played by the same rules. One of the guys he had trusted. And now he was betraying him. Mathers' pulse pounded in his ears. Morgan had gotten to Adams. That meant the walls weren't just closing in. They were collapsing. And if he didn't act fast, he was going to be buried beneath them. The betrayal and the reckoning. Greg Mathers had spent his career believing in one fundamental truth. Loyalty was everything. You watched the backs of the people who watched yours. You protected those who played by the rules, your rules. And most of all, you didn't turn on your own. But now, as he sat in his car outside an old warehouse on the outskirts of Baton Rouge, gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles turned white, he realized that truth had been shattered. Sergeant Henry Adams was the rat. A man he had trusted, a man who had kept his secrets, a man who knew everything. And now he was talking. Mathers' heart pounded against his ribs. He had spent years surviving in the department by knowing who to trust and who to keep at arm's length. But Adams had been close. Too close. If he was cooperating with Morgan, if he had flipped to the feds, then it wasn't just Mathers' career on the line. It was his freedom. His entire body tensed as he exhaled sharply. This wasn't just about a suspension anymore. This was about survival. And if Adams had decided to betray him, then Adams had just signed his own death warrant. A dangerous conversation. Mathers dialed a number he hadn't used in years. The line clicked after a single ring. "You sure you want to do this?" Vincent Cade's voice was calm, almost amused. Mathers didn't hesitate. "I need to meet him. Alone." Cade let out a slow breath. "This is messy, Greg. You sure you're thinking straight?" Mathers gritted his teeth. "I don't need a damn lecture, Cade. Just set it up." A pause. Then Cade's voice dropped to something colder. "It's done. He'll be at Miller's garage in an hour. Be smart." The line went dead. Mathers stared at the phone for a long moment before tossing it onto the passenger seat. An hour. 60 minutes to decide how this would end. The meeting that wasn't a meeting. Miller's garage was an abandoned auto shop on the west side of the city, a place where deals were made in the shadows and problems were handled before they ever made it to the public eye. Mathers had been there before, but never like this. When he pulled up, Adams was already waiting, leaning against his unmarked car, arms crossed. He looked up as Mathers stepped out, his face unreadable. Mathers approached slowly, every step deliberate. "We need to talk," he said. Adams exhaled. "Yeah, we do." The air between them was thick, heavy. Mathers didn't waste time. "You're talking to Morgan." "To IA." "To the feds." Adams didn't deny it. That alone made Mathers' stomach turn. "I did what I had to do," Adams said. Mathers let out a harsh laugh. "What you had to do?" Adams met his gaze. "You think I wanted this? You think I'd woke up one day and decided to burn everything down?" Mathers took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You should have come to me." "I did," Adams snapped. "And you didn't listen." Mathers' hands clenched into fists. All these years, he had trusted Adams to stand by him, to cover for him the way he had covered for others. But now, that trust had been shattered. "You don't get it," Mathers said, voice low. "Once you open that door, you can't close it." Adams swallowed hard. Maybe it needed to be opened. Mathers stared at him, a slow realization sinking in. Adams wasn't scared. He wasn't apologetic. He had chosen this, and that meant there was no saving him, no bringing him back into the fold. Adams was already gone. The choice that wasn't a choice. Mathers exhaled slowly, the rage inside him coiling like a snake. "There's no walking away from this, Henry," he said. "You know that, right?" Adams' jaw tightened. "I know." Silence stretched between them. Then Adams took a slow step back. "You should go home, Greg. Make peace with whatever's coming." Mathers didn't move, didn't breathe. For the first time, he saw the truth. This wasn't just about Adams talking. It was about everyone turning their backs. Morgan had made sure the department wasn't going to protect him. IA was already building a case. And now Adams, his last real ally, had switched sides. He had lost. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. For years, he had ruled through fear, through power, through knowing the system would always bend in his favor. But now the system was snapping back, and he had nowhere left to run. The end of an era. Mathers didn't sleep that night. He sat in his car outside his house, gripping the wheel, staring into the darkness. His badge sat on the seat beside him, the metal catching the dim glow of the streetlights. It wasn't protection anymore. It was a weight, a reminder of everything he had built, everything that was about to be stripped away. His phone buzzed. A message from Cade. "They're moving faster than we thought. You don't have much time. Make a decision." Mathers exhaled. He had spent his entire career making people afraid. But now, for the first time, he was the one who was afraid. He stared at the badge for a long time. Then he made his choice. One last move. One last shot at control. Because if he was going down, he wasn't going down alone.